They didn't knock, they didn't call, they didn't even send a warning. Instead, they smashed his door in like it was some kind of raid, yelling at the top of their lungs, "You're in violation." And in that single moment, everything changed. What should have been just a neighborly dispute about an HOA rule turned into something that felt like an armed invasion. But here's the thing they didn't see coming. This homeowner wasn't just some random guy living on their block. He had people on his side. People with training. People who knew how to fight back. And when his Navy SEAL brothers showed up at the HOA headquarters, the entire story flipped upside down. For most people, a homeowners association is just a group that makes sure the lawns stay cut and the mailboxes all look the same. They hand out fines for broken fences, trash cans left out too long, or paint colors they don't approve of. Annoying, sure. Sometimes unfair, definitely. But breaking down a man's door, screaming at him like he's a criminal, that takes things to a whole new level. And what happened next, when the Navy SEALs got involved, turns this from just another HOA dispute into a story that sounds almost unreal. But it happened. And once you hear all the details, you're going to ask yourself the same question I did. How far is too far when it comes to power? To understand how this all started, you've got to picture the scene. The neighborhood wasn't some chaotic inner-city street. It was a quiet suburban community. The kind of place where every house looked the same, every yard was trimmed, and kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac. On the surface, it looked like peace. But under that peace was control. Rules written down in hundreds of pages of HOA bylaws, and a board of people who enforced them like they were the law itself. The homeowner at the center of this story, let's call him David, wasn't the kind of man to pick fights. He had served his country, done his time in dangerous places, and all he wanted now was to live quietly with his family. But the HOA had other plans. At first, it was small things. A letter about his truck being parked in the wrong spot. A notice that his grass was an inch too tall. Fines stacking up that seemed less about community standards and more about intimidation. Anyone who has dealt with an HOA knows that feeling, the frustration, the helplessness, the anger at being nickel-and-dimed in your own home. But most people just pay the fines and move on. David wasn't most people. Now here's the thing, David wasn't ignoring the HOA because he didn't care. He had been away at times for work, sometimes traveling, sometimes busy with his kids. He had handled some of the violations, but others he had contested. The HOA didn't like that. To them, contesting their decisions was the same as disobedience. And when David pushed back, they decided to push harder. Then came the day that would change everything. It was early morning when David heard the noise. At first he thought it was thunder, but then came the crash, the sound of his front door splintering off the hinges. He rushed out thinking maybe it was a burglary, but what he saw wasn't criminals. It was a group of HOA enforcers. Some people call them HOA cops, not official police but private security hired by the association. They were yelling, shouting that he was in violation, demanding compliance. Imagine that. Strangers in your home, breaking in under the banner of neighborhood rules. Not police, not deputies with a warrant, just men with clipboards, radios, and the kind of aggression that comes from being given a little bit of power and too much authority. David's wife screamed. His kids were terrified. The youngest ran to his bedroom and slammed the door shut, crying. And standing there in his own living room, David felt something shift inside of him. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about humiliation, control, power, and they had just abused theirs in the worst possible way. Now here, where the story takes a turn most people wouldn't expect, David wasn't just a veteran. He had close ties to a group of Navy SEALs he had served with overseas. They weren't neighbors who might come over for a barbecue. They were brothers, men who had gone through hell and back with him. And when they heard what happened, they didn't just shake their heads. They didn't just send texts of support. They made a decision. Because in their world, loyalty runs deep. You don't let someone kick down your brother's door without answering for it. But before we get into what the SEALs did, let's stop for a second and think about this. Do you think the HOA went too far? Comment your thoughts down below. And if you think breaking down a man's door was bad, wait until you hear what happened when the SEALs paid the HOA headquarters a visit. After the raid, David documented everything: the broken doorframe, the damage inside his home, the way his wife was shaking as she tried to calm the kids down. He photographed the boot marks on the floor, the splintered wood, even the pieces of the lock that had been kicked apart. He knew this wasn't just some fine he could fight in court. It was bigger. It was personal. The HOA tried to spin it. They said he had ignored multiple warnings, that he was uncooperative, that the forced entry was necessary. But none of that explained the violence, the shouting, the intimidation. This wasn't law enforcement. This wasn't due process. This was a group of neighbors on a power trip, backed up by private muscle. That's when David's old unit started making calls. These weren't men who took intimidation lightly. They had seen worse in war zones, but seeing it happen in their own country in a suburban neighborhood lit a fire under them. They started planning, not for revenge but for accountability. The HOA had an office, a so-called headquarters, where the board held meetings and kept their records. And that's where the SEALs decided to go. Not with weapons, not with violence, but with presence. A presence that could not be ignored. And here, where you start to wonder, what happens when people used to life-and-death combat situations decide to confront something as petty as HOA abuse? The answer is, the game changes. The day the SEALs arrived at the HOA headquarters, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Imagine a group of highly trained men, moving with discipline, walking straight into a building where people were used to pushing around average homeowners. Suddenly, the power dynamics were flipped. They didn't need to raise their voices. They didn't need to break anything. Just their presence, the calm, controlled energy of people who had faced real danger, was enough to make the board members freeze in their seats. They laid everything out: the door that was smashed, the fear caused to the family, the abuse of authority. They made it clear that this wasn't going away quietly. And for once, the HOA, the same group that had bullied and intimidated countless neighbors, was on the receiving end of fear. What happened next depends on who you ask. Some say the board backed down immediately, apologizing and trying to cover their tracks. Others say they doubled down, trying to defend their actions until legal pressure mounted. But one thing is clear: after that day, the HOA never came at David again. And if you think this confrontation ended the story, you're wrong, because the aftermath was just as wild as the moment itself. Click here. You won't believe what happened after the SEALs walked out that door. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had quietly suffered under the HOA's heavy hand started coming forward with their own stories. Stories about being fined for kids leaving bikes in the driveway. Stories about notices for flowers planted in the wrong spot. Stories about intimidation, threats, and humiliation. For years, people had been too afraid to speak out. But when they saw David push back, when they saw the HOA suddenly scared for once, they realized they weren't alone. The HOA tried to control the narrative. They claimed the SEALs had stormed the headquarters, that they had come in aggressively. But those who were there knew better. The SEALs hadn't needed to storm anything. Their calm presence was enough to dismantle the facade of authority. And slowly, the cracks in the HOA's power began to show. Members of the board started resigning. Meetings grew tense. Legal challenges began piling up, all because they had pushed one man too far. This story isn't just about one man and his Navy SEAL brothers. It's about something bigger: power, and how it gets abused. HOAs were designed to keep neighborhoods orderly, but too often they become little dictatorships, run by people who let authority go to their heads. When that power crosses the line into breaking doors and terrifying families, it stops being about community and starts being about control. And that's the real crime here. Not the paint color of a house, not the length of the grass, but the way ordinary people can be bullied in their own homes by organizations that are supposed to protect property values. So let me ask you again, do you think the HOA cops went too far? Or do you think David's Navy SEAL brothers went too far when they showed up at headquarters? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear what you think. Subscribe if you got value from this story. When we left off, I told you the real crime wasn't about paint colors or grass height. It was about the way ordinary people can be bullied inside their own homes by groups that claim to protect community standards. That's where we ended part 1. But the story doesn't stop there. Because what happened after David's Navy SEAL brothers confronted the HOA at their headquarters would ripple across the entire neighborhood and even beyond. This is part 2. In the days following that confrontation, the neighborhood was buzzing. For years, residents had whispered about the HOA behind closed doors. They had complained in private conversations, muttering under their breath about unfair fines or overly strict rules. But now, they had seen something no one ever expected: the HOA actually backing down. It started with small signs. The letters that normally flooded mailboxes with notices and threats suddenly slowed down. The private security cars that used to circle the neighborhood like patrol vehicles seemed to vanish. The HOA meetings, once loud and aggressive, became tense and strangely quiet. David's family, however, was still shaken. His kids had nightmares about strangers breaking into their home. His wife jumped at every unexpected knock. And David himself, well, he wasn't the type to show fear easily, but the scars of that morning sat heavy on his mind. He had fought in war zones, yes, but never thought he'd have to defend his family from people claiming to be protectors of the neighborhood. Still, he wasn't alone. His brothers in uniform had made that clear. Something else began happening that no one saw coming. One by one, neighbors started coming to David's door. They weren't there to accuse him of anything. They weren't there to gossip. They came quietly, cautiously, and they came with stories. An older couple admitted they had been fined thousands over the years for unapproved shrubs in their front yard. A single mother explained how she was threatened with legal action for leaving her trash bin visible for more than an hour after pickup. Another man, a veteran himself, confessed that he had been warned multiple times for keeping an American flag flying past permitted hours. People had been living in fear of the HOA for years, but none of them had spoken out until now. David listened. He wrote things down. He realized his situation wasn't unique. His family wasn't the only one living under intimidation, and the more stories he collected, the angrier he became. This wasn't about his door anymore. This was about an entire community under the thumb of unchecked authority. And here, where things get interesting, because while most people would have taken those stories and maybe filed a lawsuit, David's circle operated differently. They believed in structure. They believed in exposing corruption. And most importantly, they believed in standing together. The HOA board wasn't blind to what was happening. They saw the shift in the neighborhood. They felt the tension in the air. And so, they tried to push back. First came a letter. Ironically, the same tactic they had always used. It was sent to every resident in the community. In polished language, the board claimed they were simply enforcing rules for the safety and harmony of the neighborhood. They painted David as a non-compliant homeowner who had forced their hand. They even suggested that the Navy SEALs' presence at their headquarters was a threat to community safety. But the residents weren't buying it. For too long, they had been on the receiving end of the board's heavy hand. And now, with the truth exposed, the HOA's words rang hollow. Next, the HOA tried intimidation again. They hired a new security company. Strange cars appeared, idling outside David's house. Board members walked the streets with clipboards, jotting notes in plain view. But instead of scaring people back into silence, it had the opposite effect. Neighbors began filming them, sharing videos online, and spreading the story beyond the neighborhood's gates. Suddenly, this wasn't just a local fight. People from outside the community started paying attention. A local news outlet caught wind of the incident. At first, it sounded too wild to be true, HOA members smashing down a man's door, Navy SEALs showing up at headquarters. It had the flavor of urban legend. But when they visited David's home and saw the splintered doorframe, when they spoke to neighbors with their own stories, the truth became harder to deny. The story aired on a small evening broadcast, but that was all it took. Within days, larger stations picked it up. Social media exploded with debate. Some people sided with David, arguing that the HOA had abused its power. Others criticized the SEALs, saying military men had no business confronting a civilian board. But one thing was certain: the HOA had lost control of the narrative. And if you think media attention was bad for them, wait until you hear what happened when lawyers started calling. See, David hadn't planned on going to court. He wasn't interested in lawsuits at first. But when attorneys began reaching out, civil rights lawyers, property rights advocates, he realized there was an opportunity here, not just for him but for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA. Legal papers were drafted. Claims of unlawful entry, destruction of property, intimidation and harassment were laid out in black and white. Suddenly, the same HOA that had bullied families with legal threats was now facing a legal storm of its own. The discovery process brought ugly truths to light. Emails between board members revealed personal vendettas against certain residents. Financial records showed questionable spending, fines collected from homeowners being used for personal perks rather than community improvements. It painted a picture of corruption, not protection. The board panicked. Some members resigned before they could be questioned. Others lawyered up. But the damage was done. The once feared HOA was now fractured, exposed, and publicly shamed. Through it all, David tried to keep his focus on his family. But something shifted in him too. He had gone from being a target of the HOA to being a symbol of resistance. Neighbors looked to him for guidance. Reporters wanted his side of the story. Lawyers asked him to be the lead plaintiff in a class-action lawsuit. At first, he resisted. He didn't want the spotlight. But eventually, he realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been pushed around by people who abused authority. So he stepped up. He gave interviews. He spoke at town meetings. He stood in court and told his story plainly. About the morning his door was kicked in, about his terrified children, about the way the HOA tried to justify the unjustifiable. And as his voice grew louder, so did the movement behind him. Months passed. The lawsuit dragged on. But while the courts worked slowly, the neighborhood itself changed almost overnight. Residents who had once been silent began demanding accountability. They showed up at HOA meetings in numbers too large to ignore. They demanded transparency in finances, fair enforcement of rules, and respect for homeowners' rights. Eventually, elections were held. New board members replaced the old guard. People who had lived under fear now took leadership roles, determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The HOA still existed, yes, but it no longer carried the same iron fist. Instead of being a weapon of intimidation, it began slowly, transforming into what it was supposed to be: a group of neighbors working together for the good of the community. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was better. And none of it would have happened if David hadn't stood his ground. Looking back, it's easy to say this story is about one man versus an HOA. But really, it's about something bigger. It's about how unchecked authority, whether it comes from a government, an employer, or even a neighborhood board, will always push as far as it's allowed. And it's about how one act of courage can change everything, not just for one family, but for an entire community. The HOA thought they were too powerful to be challenged. They thought homeowners would always fold under pressure. But when they smashed the wrong door, when they picked the wrong family to intimidate, They learned that power cuts both ways. Because power without accountability always leads to abuse. But power met with unity, with truth, and with courage, that leads to change. So now I'll ask you again, what do you think? Did the HOA deserve what came after? Or do you think David and his brothers pushed it too far by making that stand? Do HOAs serve a real purpose, or have they become nothing more than legalized bullies? Comment your thoughts. I want to hear every side of it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one.